Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and I'm here with Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity. And I'm delighted to be here with author Leanne Friesen. I think this is her first book. And we were just talking about it. It's called Grieving Room, Making Space for All the Hard Things After Death and Loss. And Leanne, and as I was just saying, I just started reading this book. Was blessed to receive an advance copy, and I think it officially came out last week or this week, right?
Tomorrow,
Um, well,
February 6th.
Yay, February 6th, 2024. So congratulations. And maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and how this book came to be. It's such a powerful book, and I know it's been a journey. So maybe you can just give us some of that, a piece of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, as you said, my name is Leanne, and I have been an ordained pastor for many years. And I was a pastor when I wrote this book, and was a pastor when I went through what was happening in the story in this book. And so in 2013, my much beloved oldest sister, Roxanne, died of melanoma. And what I went through at that time, I was only 35, was the experience of assuming that I knew a lot about grief. I felt pretty confident that while I absolutely dreaded the idea of my sister dying and couldn't even begin to fathom how I would cope, I did feel like I understood grief because I'd been a minister by then for almost a decade. I had officiated funerals and I'd done lots of courses in grieving, and I had journeyed with grievers. I'd sat at deathbeds, and I figured I would at least have, the littlest bit of a head start, Kate. And then discovered that I did not at all, and went through what I think every single griever goes through, which is the shock of grief when you go, wow, this is truly horrible. This is more awful than I anticipated. This is more painful than anyone warned me. And we say things like no one warns us, although people try, but why would we ever be, how would we ever be able to put it in words or ever adequately be able to prepare someone? And so I felt just so completely overwhelmed and stunned by grief. And as I went through the next few years and eventually began to move forward and come to terms with my grief, I became more and more passionate about sharing about grief. I eventually became what we call a grief educator, so to speak. I completed a certificate in grief and bereavement. And as I was doing teaching, speaking at events, I had a blog and things like that, I would sometimes write about grief. And that would always get a lot of traction, and it became a topic that became more and more important to me. And I eventually realized that this was a story I wanted to tell, this story of learning to give grief room. Because what I thought was that the goal was to figure out how to fix grief or make it easier. And I realized that I needed to learn how grief could have room and have space, and that grief needed to be, because the way through grief is grieving. And then as I was writing this book and eventually seeking a publisher, I also started an Instagram page called Grieving Room. And Grieving Room now has a pretty large following. And it's a space that I've used to hopefully encourage grievers, validate people in their grief experiences. So while I am a pastor, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I often joke that grief is my weird hobby. And it's this thing that I feel really led to support people in and to find those ways to help people understand how to give grief room. So that's me.
Thank you so much. And I really just want to underscore the word room. And each one of your chapters has the word room in it. So room for different things, room to be uncertain, room
Mhm.
for the grief to come, room in the valley of death. And I just, so as I was starting to, encounter your book and read it, I've been sitting with this idea of making room for grieving. And I'll just tell you a funny story. This
Yeah.
morning in preparation for our interview, I took an hour. I reserved an hour in my calendar to make some room for grief. And because I have several hard things going on in my life, as I've shared with you, and some grief about
Mhm.
various things. And a couple observations, it's like it's uncomfortable to sit with
Mhm.
grief, and
Mhm.
it's exhausting, and like it's tiring, it's physically tiring. So I'm just wondering if you can say maybe a little bit about that, like for people who need motivation or something to make room for the grieving and don't just want to get to the quick answers. I mean, doesn't it sound so much better to
It does.
not have to make room for all of this?
Yeah, and we don't want to. And it's interesting that you say that, because At one point in the book, I actually talk about doing exactly that, which I think is great wisdom. I call it grief time. And a friend of mine mentioned this to me shortly after my sister Roxanne died. We went out for a coffee and she said, "You have to start scheduling grief time." I tell this story in the book. And then she explained that what she meant was, you're a busy mom. My kids were little at the time. I had a full-time job. And she said, you're not always going to be able to make space for the breadth of your grief, right? And so even if you let your grief out, and I thought I was pretty good at that. If I was sad, I let myself cry. If I wanted to talk about it, I talked. But then there's so many times I'd have to quickly knit myself back together because I had something else to do, right? So as much as we might say, oh, it doesn't matter, I didn't want to show up at the playground with a red nose and eyes swollen shut from crying. I couldn't go to work and just simply be sobbing my eyes out. And so what would happen is there's lots of times if I felt grief coming that, it's like, oh, push it down, deal with it later. And so she said, actually put times in your calendar where it's okay to just grieve. And she said that could be anything. It could be that you go through the photo albums slowly. I'm of that generation. I still have photo albums. It could be you scroll through your phone. It could be that you listen to the songs that make you remember them. And maybe you'll cry. Maybe you won't. Maybe you won't need as long as you thought you did, but you've given yourself that space where you don't have to pull it all back in. It's okay to just let it be out. So good for you for saying I scheduled some grief time. Grief time's actually really, really important. But the reason we don't want to do it is because grief sucks. And it's hard and it's painful. And we want to believe that there are ways we can just sort of skirt around it. Now, for me, I went through, I'm going to get all the good books. I know this is a weird thing to say with someone who's written a book, but, I was ordering the list of the most recommended books and I will read those. My first week after loss, I'm reading each of the books, probably a little premature. I scheduled a grief counselor appointment 3 weeks into my loss, because I was going to do all the good things. I was going to be a very good griever, Kate. And it took me a while to realize that so much of grief, it just needed space. And I wasn't going to be able to find a perfect thing. I wasn't going to be able to find a perfect method. All those things were actually really important. I'm glad I did all of them, but they were all actually in and of themselves part of the grieving. And the grieving does eventually help us through our grief, but it's a very painful reality of what we go through to get through that grief. And so when I say making grief room, so often what we think we need to do as grievers, as one, we need to figure out the way to stop feeling bad or feeling angry or feeling sad or whatever it is we're feeling, or we want to project a certain way of feeling. I mean, just think of how often we say, oh, they're doing really well. And almost always what they mean is they're not crying too much or they're working or they're holding it in, right? And then what it means to give room to others is to avoid our need to try and fix it or explain it away. And we all know this because we all do this. We feel like, we go to the funeral home, the funeral, or we see someone after loss, and we feel like we have to say something. We have to say the thing that will make it better. We have to do the thing that will fix it. And so when someone says, and I'm going to be extreme here, I wish I died with them, we want to say, no, 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 you have children to live for. You have some. Well, that's not really giving grief room. I'm not saying that we don't address genuine suicidal thinking, but in that moment, that's just someone saying, I'm really hurting. And giving grief room is saying, tell me about it. Or that must be really sad. Wow, it sounds awful. Do you want to talk some more? Right? Giving grief room is not necessarily needing to theologize everything away. They're in a better place. It's for the best. Everything happens for a reason. Most grievers really find those statements difficult as much as they're said with good intention and as much as they may be true. Grieving room is letting a griever cry. It's letting a griever be angry. It's letting your grieving friend be a bit of a disaster for a while, be hard to be around, be a mess, be awkward, and saying, it's okay, you're grieving. And I think culturally, we really have struggled to give grief room for a long time because our assumption is that the task of grieving is to stop grieving. And while our grief eventually changes and it can look different, we carry grief with us for a long time.
Well, thank you for that. Um, you know, this is really just such an important message, and I'm so glad that you're writing about it and speaking about it. And I know it's such a ministry for you. So thank you. I want to ask you a question actually about you've been using the word grievers, people who are grieving. And in the subtitle of your book is making space for all the hard things after death and loss. And so I want to ask you about the word loss because,
Yeah.
I think sometimes people feel that they're, what a lot of people I know, including myself, but a lot of people say, well, other people have it worse than me.
Oh,
So,
I
and
love to do
that's
that.
one thing. So, but then also if you haven't experienced death, but there have been other substantial losses, do you feel like your book and your message is relevant to that wider group of grievers, not just, in addition to people who are dealing with death? Does that make sense?
I hope so. I really do. I definitely focus the book, or the linchpin of the book is this loss of my sister. And so much of the experiences stem specifically from my sister's death and what I learned about that. But I address many kinds of loss in the book and acknowledge them: loss through divorce, loss through illness, loss through job loss. All these realities of loss we experience. And that's why that title was important to me, that it says after death and loss. And there's a weird thing that happens when we've had loss. And you do this a lot. On one hand, we often try to minimize our losses. On another hand, we want them to be seen for how special and significant they are. And so there's that element of saying other people have it worse. Maybe someone in our life is sick, but I still have them with me. I could be much sicker. Other people suffered worse than me. Or if we've had a death, well, at least they lived a long life. At least they're not suffering anymore. At least we had a good relationship, all these things. And so we feel this need to sort of downplay it because we haven't learned culturally how to make space for some of those things. And then on the other side, there's actually also that piece that when you're grieving, that desperately needs people to see how special your grief is. And so we do this in lots of ways, right? And so, for example, if someone has lost someone who's quite a bit older and they've had a long life, so maybe you can think of times someone said, my grandmother died, she was 95, but it was really sudden and we weren't expecting it. And it's sort of this way of naming, it's hard, right? And they want to name, it's hard. Or they'll say, my mother died and she was my best friend. And you can hear what they're saying, right? They're trying to say, please see that my grief is very special. Please see that it's not just another grief. And so we feel a need to kind of do both these caveats that are very, very interesting. And I hope on one hand, we can make space to say every grief is very important. Now, I'm always hesitant to overly compare losses to death because sometimes if someone's had a death, it can feel really minimizing to say, someone says, I know exactly what you've been through. I lost my job last week. Or they say, I know that your 3-year-old just died. Oh, I felt the same way when my grandmother died. And people hate that. Of course they do. And so the comparison game is tricky. So I always invite people to say, we don't need to compare, but we can still empathize. And so if someone's lost a child, we don't need to compare. We don't need to say, I know what you've been through. We don't. We never know exactly what someone experiences in their grief. But if we had a loss, we can use that to bring that empathy, right? And say, when I've had losses, I remember how very, very hard it is. And so I'm really thinking of you. I really care about you because I remember and I know how hard grief can be. I don't know this loss. I haven't been through this one. Hopefully, it makes us compassionate. And so when we think of loss, there are so many different kinds of loss. And I hope we can make space for the grief that comes with all of those losses, and space to recognize that they're each special and important, and that means that we don't need to minimize them. They can be what they are. And we don't need to minimize them. And that also means then we don't need to compare them. So we don't need to convince why they're important. Let's just let them each be what they are. And I think that can be okay.
Well, thank you for that. Again, such wisdom and um, just really concrete, just really helpful. So, my other question to you is, aside we talked some about making time for grief, literal time in the calendar. Can you just talk some more about some of the other practices? Because what I really hear you say is there's no way but through, right? So
Yeah,
as we
that's
journey
a
through
good
the grief,
summary.
which is such a, good truism, but unfortunately, I think part of it is we just don't want that to be true for each of us. We know it's true for people maybe. Um, so But I think actually that really gets to the heart of my question, which is how do we do this in the context of community? So, if I have a good friend who's going through a tremendous loss and we sat together and I hope I did what you described, made space for her grief and didn't, try to rush her out of it or anything. And she's still sitting with it. Of course she is. This was last week. So how can we be in community with each other as what can the griever do if the griever is feeling lonely and isolated or without community, but maybe doesn't know how or feel how to connect. So can you just talk a little bit about that? Does that question make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And on my Instagram page, one of the things I commonly post about that gets a lot of resonance, but also a lot of sadness, is some version of saying grief is lonely. And so the first thing I want to say to grievers is that grief is lonely. And people will let you down when you grieve. And I have a chapter that says that room for people to let you down, where I name that part of my journey was realizing that people would mess up. And here's the thing about grieving: people in your life will say profoundly hurtful things, or they'll say nothing, and that will hurt. And here's what's really challenging about it. Sometimes the person who's really helpful one day will be really hurtful the next day. And sometimes what one person says one day, the next day another person will say, and it'll feel hurtful that day because grief is so erratic and unpredictable. Which is why part of our journey is realizing that we will have these feelings of feeling like people don't get it and they don't understand it. And so some of our journey is making space for that, which can sometimes mean that we're going to learn to forgive and say that person didn't know what they were doing. They didn't mean to hurt me. They said something dumb, but they were doing their best. Sometimes it will mean making space to have hard conversations and saying to people, you've hurt me, you've let me down, I've needed more, if we feel able to do that. Sometimes it will even mean realizing a relationship will shift a little. We may say, I realized maybe that was a bit of a selfish relationship, that person is someone that isn't going to be there for me in the way that I need. And so, what will our relationship look like going forward? Maybe that's a relationship that we're a little bit more about going to the mall and going to a movie, and that's okay. And we learn to make space for the type of relationship that it is. It stinks that on top of grieving, we had to negotiate all these other things, but it's part of the reality of loss. So, how do we make space for that when we're grieving? So, part of me is starting by realizing that no one will fully understand your grief. Part of it is recognizing that we also will need to ask for help. And one of my journeys was learning to do that. It was very hard for me. I'm not naturally an expressive, emotional person if I don't have control of it. I'm very open to talking about the book, talking about death, but I don't like, falling apart in front of people, which meant that if people came up and said, how are you doing? I would hear myself say, I'm hanging in there. Because you kind of learn to find the rote statement in order to keep it together. And there were many times that was exactly what I needed to do. But there were probably even more times that people would walk away and I'd think, why did I just lie? Why didn't I say, I'm having a real hard time? Would you pray for me? Or would you just, give me a hug? Or can I talk for a few minutes? Or this is harder than I thought. I had a really hard time doing that. And so I encourage grievers to find the ways to communicate that works for them. And this is just very pragmatically because it is hard to be put on the spot. And so, on one hand, thinking about those responses, what's a response that feels authentic that you can give when you don't want to talk? And what's a response that you can give when maybe you want to be more vulnerable that will help open that door? And so that's a helpful one. But then also, how will you reach out? And I encourage people to look for what I call their safe people. And not everyone will be your safe people. Lots of people will be people you can just chat with. But who are the people that you can really say, I'm having an awful day? When you start out grieving, there's going to be a lot of those people because people will gather around you in droves, but the numbers dwindle. That's normal and that's okay because the world can't live in that heaviness of grief with us all the time. We'd just be perpetually exhausted as a society if we were all carrying that level of grief that's around us, right? And so you
Mhm.
find your 3 or 4 people, maybe even less, that you can call up and say, this is a real hard day, or could we go for a coffee? Or the anniversary is coming up. It may be that you need to find a grief counselor or a pastor or a therapist that can be that person that you talk to. So those two pieces, that ability to respond when the people are reaching out, the ability to reach out yourself, and I think the ability to advocate for yourself. And I know this is putting a lot on grievers. And I say that, I say it stinks that now you're going to become a grief educator. And you are, because when you're grieving, you all kind of have to become a grief educator. And what that means is when your friend calls you up and says, "Are you coming to the Christmas party 2 months after your father dies?" And you say, "I don't know if I'm up for it." "Why? What's wrong?" Blah, blah, blah. And that you actually have to say, "I know it probably doesn't seem like very long to you since my father died, but I actually still have a really hard time going to parties, and I'll go if I can, but I might have a really bad day that day and not be able to go." And that actually surprises a lot of people because they don't realize how long grief lasts or the way it plays out. And so that ability to also just explain those little things when you need to is also something we can practice doing. I know it's hard because it feels like it's just telling grievers more they have to do, but I
Well,
think we start learning these skills.
yeah. I
Does it
mean,
make sense?
actually, it's so helpful because, I'm one of the things that I'm doing, I've been pretty public about is that my husband was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
And so,
And that's a
when
grief.
we first got yeah, I mean, but when we first got the diagnosis, we were concerned it was something much more serious. So there's like, some relief mixed in and of course, gratitude and thankness and joy, but there's also grief now and there's also sort of anticipated grief. So I think actually just having other grievers who've gone through the journey like yourself share the wisdom, forward
Mhm.
and back and throughout is really helpful because that kind of thing is concrete. That's the kind of thing a person can do, like know how to reach out, but internally I think the experience is still grief, right? And so my next question is about patience. And I think one of the thing I'm married to a Buddhist husband who meditates a lot. And so he's very patient, as you can expect. And so my question is like, how do we be patient with our own grief and with other people's grief? And actually what I have a hard time with is being patient with my own grief. I'm much better about being patient with other people. So
Oh,
does that
interesting.
maybe you can, I
Yeah.
just want my own feelings to move along
Yeah.
faster than they are.
Well, yeah, and I think if I'll start with being patient with, and first of all, I'm so sorry about your husband, and I'm so glad to hear that you're naming that it's grief and all the grief that you're naming, right? That grief for what you've lost. And you're actually like saying everything that we're talking about, right? That, oh, it could be worse. We're glad it wasn't this. So those feelings of trying not to go down this pit of despair, but then also needing to name it and then intermix this gratitude. I have a chapter called Room for the And that is the journey of grief, right? That we make room for that and that we are grateful and we are sad and we're really thankful that their suffering's done and we wish they could have lived longer and never got sick in the first place. And so when I think about being patient with other grievers, the first thing I want to say is if you have a griever in your life, they are grieving so much longer and deeper and so much more in an all pervasive way than you realize. And so we tend to think those first few months. And then it often surprises us when we talk to someone 6 or 7 months into grieving and you're like, oh, so you're still really struggling. Friends, 6 months in is like baby grief. Like it's still like in the incubator phase. It's still very raw and very fresh. So one of the ways you can be patient is by reminding yourself that grief lasts a long time and the depth of it lasts a long time so that you're not going, is there something wrong with them? Do they have complicated grief? Maybe they need to be over this by now, but you're going, oh, this is normal. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I get it. You know? Just recently, I was talking to someone on Christmas Eve at church, and I had buried her husband earlier that year. And she said, I know I'm supposed to be happy because today is Christmas Eve, but to me, it's the 11th month anniversary of being a widow. Now, I'd forgotten her husband had actually died on the 24th, but I thought that was such a great example. It was 11 months later, so raw to her. And I said, of course, 11 months is still very raw and very fresh. And so, if you want to help be patient with grievers, remember that those big feelings you saw at the funeral are just as big 6 and 7 months later. So, that same compassion you had then, if you can rally it then, that's a good reminder. But in terms of being patient with ourselves, I think that's where learning about grief and finding those spaces to talk about it and be validated are so helpful because what we tend to do is think we're doing it wrong. And I have yet to meet a griever in all my years of supporting grievers. And I've met with so many and now encourage so many online, hopefully encourage them, but, or at least validate them. And at some point they say, I think I'm doing this wrong. I must be broken. There must be something wrong with me because there's no way it should be this hard. Because if it was this hard, the world couldn't function. Like how has everyone else lived through this? And you go, no, it is this hard. It is. And so there's this piece that thinks because it's terrible, because I'm a mess, because I'm yelling at my kids, because I'm exhausted, because I can't seem to get back to work, or because I can't seem to take on anything extra, or because I feel irritated with everyone, or because I am crying still so easily, we think I'm broken. I'm doing something wrong. And when we find spaces to read those books about grief, or there's so many wonderful places you could follow, for example, on Instagram, on Threads, Facebook groups, when you join that grief support group, or when you just find someone who's been through grief, that's when you go, okay, I'm normal. And that's what helped me be patient with myself. I didn't go to grief groups. That not being great at crying in front of people piece made that a little hard for me. So you have to know yourself. I found one-on-one really helpful. And my safe people were people who had lost. So a couple of women I knew, one who'd lost a child, one who'd lost a sister. And I knew if they came and said, how are you? That they meant, how are you doing with your grief? And I knew I could give them an honest answer. And I knew I could say things like, this happened to me this week. Is that normal? Did you go through that? And we could talk about it. So finding the places where you could say, are you going through this too? Right? Have you been screaming at people at stoplights? Just me? And some people will and some people won't. Or if it's someone say, no, but I did scream at my husband this morning. I had no idea why. Or someone say, did you start sobbing in the grocery store anytime soon? And almost every griever has had a grocery store meltdown. And they'll say, yeah, it was the cereal. Oh, for me, it was the song playing, and you go, oh, okay. Not just me. And I think that helps us be patient with ourselves. At least I hope.
Well, thank you for that. And we need to wrap up soon. So I just want to turn to your book.
Thanks.
Again, back to your book. And I just want to say again, what a wonderful gift this has been for me so far. And I told you
Wow.
before we started recording that even just having the book on my bedside shelf has sort of become an icon for me. And again, this concept of making room for
Mm.
for all our feelings, including grief,
Yes.
and I think is a really important reminder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it seems like we're both women and mid-age. Like I think I'm thinking a lot about perimenopause, and there's also developmental
Yeah.
griefs as our children age,
Yes.
as
Yeah.
parents age
Hmm.
and get sick. So I think there's just there's not probably going to be a time in our lives when we don't need to make room for grief. So
Well,
I really am grateful for this book. Go
yeah,
ahead.
and I listened to a podcast just recently that said, sorry to any of you middle-aged folks out there, which I am, I'm 46, and it said that 48 is statistically one of the saddest reported ages. And they said that, sorry to depress anyone who's 48, but I looked around and I thought, yeah, because they said your kids are often starting to leave home or they're out of that phase, and it's when we're starting to lose the generation before us. And so it's often when people are starting to lose parents or parent are getting sick or they've already lost parents. And really, as he was talking, I was like, he's talking about grief. And he's talking about us going through a season where we realize how much grief is all around us and what grief is coming. Now, when I lost my sister, I was 35. And for me, and some people have this experience, that was such a lonely experience because so few people my age had had that type of loss, right? By that phase, it was mostly grandparents or just, not that that's not terribly sad. Um, but I hardly knew anyone who'd lost a sibling. And even now, people are starting to lose parents, but not so many people's siblings. And now, as my friends are starting to have losses, it's interesting to watch our grief dialogues change because now we're all entering loss. Now, all our friends have had some level of loss. And so we do start to realize griefs around us. And certainly at middle age, that can be a hard reality. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that you name that.
Well, and I think I mean, not to make this too much about me, but I mean, I think
That's okay.
what has happened is I've been getting caught off guard by grief. So
Mm.
I'm also 46 and my husband's older, and so our last child just got into college, and so we're a few months away from being an empty nester. And we've been working so hard to get this child into college, and then 4 days after we find out that she's gotten into college, I'm hit with like a tsunami of grief. And of course, I've heard about this kind
Girl,
of
I can't
grief,
even
right?
talk about it. My husband knows this. Like, I can't even, my son's in grade 11. I can't, like, I'm like, I can't even talk about it. Yeah. So I got it. Yeah.
There's just, I think again, having encouragement from one another to make space for grief I think
Mhm.
in your first chapter, you said we have just such a culture of optimism. When we want to just be okay and be productive and be contributing and be happy and, or at least be peaceful, be all these good things, to make space for grief is unattractive. But I think it's necessary. It's what's the choice? What's the other option? And then
Well,
to
and
be
the
able
thing
to say,
is,
well,
it's there anyway. It's the elephant in the room, right? So
yeah.
it's not like by pretending it's not there, that it's not real. And it's realizing that the grief um is a friend in disguise because it feels like he's a guy running. I used this analogy this morning. Like it's almost like being pushed out of the front of a train, right? But we don't see the train. All we see is someone just pushed us. And we're like, you're such a jerk. That hurt. I hurt myself. And then you go, oh, you just kept me from getting hit by the train. And grief in some ways is like that. It really hurts, but it's actually the thing that allows us to keep going so that we're not completely destroyed in the midst of our losses and our hurt, because grieving is about making that space. It's about processing. It's about learning how we move forward, taking with us those pieces of our life into the next season of our life. It's the grief of saying, here's what was, and here is now what will be. And grief helps us do that, even when we're
And
46.
well, amen. Thank you.
46
Thank
is a rough
you.
one. I'm
Thank
with
you.
you.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, there's no, yeah, this is life, right? So thank you for naming so clearly what is true. And I just maybe my final question, and then I also want to ask you, where can we find your book? And how can we, how can we follow your work? And also, I just maybe my last question, I have so many things I want to ask you, but just to get one more in is, and I don't know, I'm reading the chapter on lament right now, but I think so many of us are worried about the global geopolitical
Mhm.
situation. And, I'm also thinking about sort of grief and patience and some of these same themes in the context of, perhaps the loss of innocence around, what we think democracy could or should be globally and in our own countries. So I'm just wondering if, I realize that that is not the purpose of your book, is that sort of more zoomed out take on it. But sort of as we experience collective fear or collective grief, do you feel like some of the same lessons apply? So that's my last question. And then also, can you just tell us a little bit about, how we can stay connected with you and your writing? Thanks.
I do absolutely think they apply. And I like that you use the term collective grief because that is a thing. Collective grief is cultural grief where we collectively grieve together. And of course, we've seen it in our lifetime in so many different ways. One of the most pervasive ways was after 9/11. We understood in a profound way in our lifetimes this reality of collective grief. And we could pick so many other examples. And globally today, we are experiencing collective grief every time we turn on the news and we feel that heaviness. And there's so many different types of grief. You already mentioned today anticipatory grief, that grief of, I know something's going to happen. I'm anticipating a loss. There's cumulative grief, and collective grief contributes to cumulative grief. And cumulative grief is loss upon loss. And sometimes you'll hear people say things like, my mother died, and then I lost my job, and then my dog died, and it was too much. And that's cumulative grief. And what's happening is our culture is adding to our cumulative grief in so many ways, right? So we're already feeling this weight, and then it just feels like there's so much other loss that we may be experiencing. And I think the same things apply, that we have to make that space for lament. We have to make that space to process it. We don't need to bright side things. We don't need to pretend that that grief isn't real. And that would be where I'd say we learn to take some of these things for that cumulative and collective grief that we experience. Does that answer your question a little?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great one. Well, Leanne, I just want to say congratulations again on your book. Let me show the cover again. Grieving Room, so beautiful. It's in hardback. I love it. Published by Broadleaf Books.
Yeah.
comes out
They did a beautiful
February
job
6th,
with it.
2024, and I'm going to post this today, so it'll be
That's
in real
tomorrow.
time, and the subtitle is Making Space for All the Hard Things After Loss and Death. So thank you so much for,
Yes.
really what sounds just like a really big ministry that you're doing for many, many people. So I'm grateful. And
Yes.
yeah, and is there a website where we can follow you,
Yes.
or an
So yeah.
Instagram?
Yeah. So the Instagram page is at grieving.room. And that's where I share kind of regular snippets about grief. Sometimes when you're grieving, a book is a lot. I realize that. And so it's someone called it today snack size portions. And that page is very much designed to do that. And I hope you'll feel safe there. If you just want to learn about grief, read the post, read the comments, and you'll learn a lot, I think, from other grievers. My website's leannefriesen.com. I'll have updates there. And of course, just other social media places. You can find me at Leanne Friesen. And you can buy the book at Amazon, Indigo in Canada, Barnes and Noble, all those standard places. Check out your local bookstores, and directly from Broadleaf Publishers. And there is a link on my website, leannefriesen.com, that has those quick click links if you'd like to buy it.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, Leanne. And again, congratulations on the
Thank
launch, and
you.
blessings in your
And
continued many
blessings to you with
ministries.
all you're going through. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, again, we're all, unfortunately, it just seems like we're all going through a lot. So I'm glad we're going through, I'm glad we have community, and I'm really, really grateful for conversations like this to sort of help along the way. So blessings, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care.